nice intro, and thanks to everybody for joining me. I'm speaking to you from my study in Belmont, I guess about 20 miles south of you. And I wish I was up there in the Tewksbury Library. I spoke there before, and it was a great time. But I guess this is the best we can do. And I hope I could take your mind off the pandemic for a few minutes anyway. So yeah, I've been writing about college and reporting on college admissions for about 20 years now, mainly focusing on preferences for wealthy white applicants. I've called these preferences the preferences of privilege. I'm probably best known as the author of The Price of Admission, which was originally published in 2006 and then was reissued last fall with a new chapter on the current college admission scandal. And my book's been given a fair bit of credit, maybe more than it deserves, for predicting that scandal, which, as you recall from the saturation, media coverage, more than 30 parents, including, Lori Loughlin and, another actress name drops out of my mind at the moment, were charged with paying a total of more than $25 million to an independent counselor named Rick Singer, to get their children into elite colleges illegally, mainly by bribing college coaches to portray them falsely as athletic recruits and by fixing their SAT or ACT scores. So I'll talk a little about the evolution of college admissions over the time I've covered it and the factors that led up to this wrongdoing. Then I'll talk a little bit about the scandal itself and what it means and my reporting on it. And I'll read you a passage or two from the new chapter in my book, some of which was in the New Yorker, about what I found. My journalism career actually is more than 40 years now, but I was at the Globe, as Robert mentioned, for years, but I didn't cover education there. When I joined the Wall Street Journal in 1999, that's when my beat became higher education, and I started focusing on college admissions. And already then, as now, one of the issues was affirmative action. The preferences that are given to underrepresented minorities, African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans in college admissions. And this became big news in 2003 when an affirmative action case reached the US Supreme Court. And that was a lawsuit brought by white students who had been rejected by the University of Michigan, even though they had better records than minority students who had been admitted. And my editor was on my case and demanded that I find a fresh angle. So I started looking through all the big stack of documents in the case. Whenever a case gets as far as the Supreme Court, the documents piles about 5 feet high. And I saw that from the documents that Michigan had a lot of preferences for admission other than affirmative action. For example, it gave an edge to children of alumni who were known as legacies, to children of donors, children of state legislators responsible for the university's budget, and athletes in a whole range of sports, most of them relatively obscure and played only at prep schools and elite private schools. And then I had an insight. I realized that all of these other preferences skewed white and wealthy. They had racial implications just like affirmative action did, only in the opposite direction. Now, they were legal, whereas the legality of affirmative action is questionable because they weren't overtly racial, but they essentially amounted to white affirmative action. So I wrote a series of articles in the journal about these preferences, identifying various low-achieving students who had gotten into top universities because they came from rich and powerful families and because their parents were alumni or donors, even though they weren't alumni. These articles caused a big stir. The journals, they were essentially attacking the journal's reading audience, which was white and wealthy. And it was a tribute to the journal that they published them. And, the articles were also noteworthy because they contradicted what college officials were saying at the time, and sometimes even still say, and what people then, typically believed. Things like there's a firewall between fundraising and admissions, legacy preference is only a tiebreaker between equal applicants, and other things that I demonstrated were false. My article showed that legacy preference was a big edge, that fundraising routinely interfered in admissions, and so on. One of my articles was about how the children of the Supreme Court justices themselves had benefited from legacy preference. For example, Sandra Day O'Connor, who was a justice at the time, was a Stanford graduate and trustee, and lo and behold, a couple of her kids went to Stanford. Ultimately, the Supreme Court, in a close decision, upheld affirmative action in the Michigan case, and O'Connor wrote the deciding opinion. And some commentators, including Justice Clarence Thomas, who wrote a dissent, said that my series influenced the Supreme Court's decision because judges like O'Connor were worried that if preferences from minorities would be outlawed, then legacy preference, which primarily benefits whites, would be, the next to fall. So they were, the argument was they were protecting themselves. Now, I then expanded my series into this book, The Price of Admission, which got a lot of attention at the time, and it seems to continue to speak to readers, including, parents and college students and educators and others. And, I take some pride in that because it's rare that a work of investigative nonfiction has such a long shelf life. Every time it starts to fade, something in the news brings it back. For example, my chapter on Harvard admissions focused on a young fellow named Jared Kushner, not because I anticipated that he would marry Donald Trump's daughter and that Trump would become president, but because Jared got into Harvard despite a mediocre high school record after his rich and rather notorious father, who had been convicted, if you recall, Jared Kushner's father was convicted and imprisoned for hiring a prostitute to seduce his brother-in-law in order to get back at his sister for ratting on him about his campaign donations, something very complicated. Anyway, Jared's father had pledged $2.5 million to Harvard, and somehow Jared then got in. So Jared Kushner has been, I'm grateful to him because he's been responsible for a lot of the continuing attention to my book. Similarly, I had a chapter called The New Jews about how Asian Americans are discriminated against in college admissions. That issue became the basis for a lawsuit against Harvard that is currently winding its way through the federal courts. Harvard won at the first level, and then it's been appealed. And it's widely expected to reach the US Supreme Court. That lawsuit seeks to strike down affirmative action from minorities on the grounds that it discriminates against Asian Americans who don't qualify for affirmative action. My view on that lawsuit, by the way, can be summed up in 4 words: right victim, wrong villain. It's accurate that Asian Americans are held to a higher standard, but it's wrong to blame affirmative action for other minorities like African Americans. It makes more sense to say that the children of alumni and donors are taking slots that ought to go to higher achieving Asian Americans. But the main reason my book remains timely is that the problem I tried to fix, or at least address, remains unchanged and actually is even more rampant. None of the recommendations in the last chapter of my book have been adopted. And colleges are giving bigger preferences to children of alumni and donors than ever. They're for a variety of reasons. They're more desperate for big gifts because other sources haven't kept pace, from government funding to small grassroots contributions. They're also even more selective than they were when my book came out. When my book came out, Harvard was admitting 10% of its applicants. Now it's 5%. The University of Southern California, which was one of the big institutions involved in the college admission scandal, as recently as like 1995 or so, it was admitting more than 70% of its applicants. Now it admits 13%. So that means that rich parents are even more nervous about getting their kids into prestigious universities. And with income inequality, we've had a bunch of new billionaires who are, have the means to buy their kids way into college and are sometimes, so desperate. Sometimes it's not even one college. I did a piece last year for New York Magazine about a hedge fund billionaire named David Shaw, who essentially hedged his college admissions bets. Starting in 2011, when the oldest of his 3 children was about 2 years away from applying to college, Shaw's foundation started giving $1 million a year to Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and Stanford each, and at least $500,000 each to Columbia and Brown. And he's kept that up ever since for a total of roughly $40 million. He was spreading the money around to make sure that his kids would get into at least one of these top colleges, and it worked. They got into Yale. Now, there's one other important trend that leads directly to the college admission scandal, and that's the rise of independent college counselors, like that guy, Rick Singer. When I wrote my book, they're referenced, but they were just emerging. Now there's 25,000 or so of these independent counselors, about 10,000 full-time and 15,000 part-time. Basically, high school guidance counselors are so overburdened, they can't necessarily pay attention to every junior and senior's, college interests. And so the more affluent parents hire these private counselors. But the problem is that the incentives are set up wrong. The high school guidance counselors are responsible to the school, their bosses, and to the families of all the parents. So they can't just go wild and make up stuff on behalf of one kid. But the independent counselors aren't responsible to anybody except their clients, the parents, who can be very demanding and unrealistic in their expectations. So when they insist on their child, Jane or John has to go to USC or Georgetown or Duke, the independent counselor, has to find a way, or other parents, may not hire them. The word on the street may not be that favorable. So in this context of ever increasing desperation and lack of monitoring and supervision and catering to the wealthy, it was inevitable that at some point, people of means would go beyond the legal ways of buying their kids into college, namely giving to the university, and start doing it illegally. It's a very short leap from paying a college to admit your child, which is legal, to paying a college coach, bribing a college coach, which isn't. And it's an interesting debate about there's a legal difference, but is there a moral difference? And people take different views on this. And as Rick Singer never tired of pointing out to his clients, the parents, the illegal method, bribing the college coach, has the advantage of being more surefire than making a gift to a university, because it pretty much guarantees the kid's admission. And it's also cheaper because college coaches, are not especially wealthy, particularly not in the, highest publicized revenue producing sports. So they'll, be swayed by a smaller gift than what it takes to get a low achieving kid admitted to a well-endowed university ordinarily. So, when this scandal broke, I figured it was time to update my book. And the chapter basically follows, the new chapter basically follows two narratives. And one of them tells the story of Rick Singer himself. Excuse me. It starts with his childhood in a Jewish suburb of Chicago, goes through his college years, his unsuccessful career as a high school and college basketball coach, and then his shift into the emerging field of independent counseling. I found basically that he was a con man from the very beginning. For example, what I found was that when he was an assistant basketball coach at Sacramento State in California in the early 1990s, his bio in the media guide said he had been captain of the basketball team, all region, of his college basketball team in Texas, Trinity in Texas, all region, and an academic All-American. I checked, and all those claims were false. So when Sacramento State had a terrible year, the basketball team in the early 90s, the whole coaching staff was fired, including Singer. So he needed a new gig, and he made his transition into independent college counseling. I want to read you a passage where I describe the move he made and what it led to, and a bit about his personality. Forgive me while I put on my reading glasses here, because my book's print is smaller than I can easily see, particularly at twilight. At the age of 31, Rick Singer found himself at a crossroads. Overmatched in Division I, Sacramento State lost 24 of 28 games in 1991-92 and dismissed the entire coaching staff. Married and jobless, He made ends meet by substitute teaching in the Sacramento schools. But he had his eye on a new profession that seemed to suit him. He would still be recruiting, still mentoring young people, still coaching, just not sports. Nevertheless, many of his clients would be athletes, and the high school and college coaches he had befriended would be useful contacts. It would be a gamble, but he would be his own boss and a pioneer in an emerging and potentially lucrative specialty, independent counseling for affluent families seeking to send their children to increasingly selective universities. Preparing for a career change, Singer earned a master's degree in school counseling from the University of Laverne. By 1994, he was the first independent counselor in Sacramento. He called his enterprise Future Stars. Soon, well-off parents, doctors, lawyers, business people were clamoring and paying for his advice. What he lacked in expertise, he made up for in chutzpah. I did see him tell a kid, "You mind if I put in your application that you were in the Key Club?" recalled a former business associate who requested anonymity. When Singer requested brochures from colleges, he told them he was working with more than 500 students. The actual number was about 50. He did embellish, even back then, the former associate said. He was a petty criminal back then. But petty wasn't quite Singer's style. His vision and ambition were on a grander scale, swelling until they culminated in the massive scam finally exposed by Operation Varsity Blues. He now enjoys a reputation as a criminal mastermind, but the reality is more complex. Although he shrewdly identified and exploited procedures that depended on trust and were vulnerable to abuse, Singer didn't fool everybody. Well before 2011, when court documents indicate that his bribing of coaches and test administrators began, he was notorious among insiders for boosting students' chances by pretending that they were racial minorities or by burnishing their extracurricular resumes. Singer had one white applicant identify himself as Hispanic to qualify for affirmative action, the former business associate recalled. It blew up. The college questioned it because he didn't put it on the SATs, which ask about ethnicity. Many people, other independent counselors, high school guidance counselors, Singer's own employees, suspected him of cheating. At least one prep school banned him from its campus. It didn't matter. The ultimate rogue operator, Singer didn't need the blessing of schools, colleges, professional counseling associations, or anyone else. He did just fine ignoring everyone's rules in favor of his own. He knew how to appeal to rich parents panicking over their children's prospects of getting into exclusive universities. He promised the certainty they craved and at a bargain price compared with the legal donation needed to improve their chances. What we do is we help the wealthiest families in the US get their kids into school, he explained to one parent, according to court documents. They want guarantees. They want this thing done. There is a front door, which means you get in on your own. The back door is through institutional advancement, which is 10 times as much money. And I've created this side door in. You know, as I said, he wasn't a mastermind, but he was smart. And his side door exploited an interesting gap in the admissions system. Essentially, when an athlete was when a college coach would have an athletic recruit and bring the name to admissions, the admissions committee at the college would look at the recruit's academic credentials. They didn't think to look at the athletic credentials. Their thinking was, why would a coach bring us somebody who can't play? Let's see if they have the scores and the grades. So nobody was scrutinizing the academic credential of the athletic credentials of these sports recruits. You know, they just took the coach's word for it. Well, but there are reasons that why a coach could, and in Singer's scheme did, use their scarce recruiting slots on a kid who couldn't play, couldn't make the team. And that's because college teams in many sports have more players than they generally need. There may be 15 or more players on a college tennis team, for example, but you only need 8 or some number like that to actually play a college tennis match. So just as in the old days or in the traditional method, a parent might a rich donor might get their kid into a college, and then that kid would, apply for the basketball team. And even though they couldn't play, the coach would put the kid at the end of the bench to please the donor. Maybe that way they'll refurbish the arena, they'll build us a new stadium, whatever. In this way, the coaches were taking a bribe and then filling a slot with somebody who couldn't play because they have more slots than they really needed. Those slots are there in case of, massive injuries or in case a bunch of players quit or something like that. It doesn't often happen, so the coach can afford to essentially fake a few recruits. And the truth is that a lot of times the athletic department doesn't really check that closely either. I mean, they know that they expect the coach to win, and so they figure the coach will bring in the best players. Now, one other thing I investigated that ended up being the other half of my narrative in this scandal was, who are the victims? There's been a lot of debate of who are the victims of this college admissions scandal, and are there any? Now, the colleges, when this came out, they all said, oh, we've been victimized, we've been cheated, Singer exploited our goodwill. But that's ridiculous in my view, because the colleges essentially, their extensive marketing, their pushing up of applications caused the desperation of parents that make schemes like this succeed. If they weren't blanketing the country with brochures to get many more people apply than could ever get in, parents would not be that nervous. And another thing colleges do is they give a series of admissions preferences, not just for the high-profile sports like basketball or football or baseball, but for very small niche sports that only the wealthy and the generally play it at elite prep schools or at suburban high schools. And so in those kind of niche sports where it's fencing or squash or sailing, those are particularly susceptible to this kind of bribery. The coaches are not paid that well. The admissions committee is not that sophisticated. And if you take a kid who's, and you say, oh, we just recruited a quarterback, if the kid never played quarterback, somebody might notice. But that's not true for somebody in a very obscure sport. So most of these kids tended to be in crew or in sailing or in something where, the media are not exactly on guard to see who the recruits are at that particular position. So the colleges were not the victims. They were more the perpetrators. And then, you could argue with some more justification that some of the students themselves who the coaches were bribed to let in were in a sense the victims. A lot of these students did not know that their parents were bribing the coach. They thought that they were getting in on their own merits, and so it's sad to think of them and their reaction when this is all exposed, and they realize that, my parents must have had a pretty low opinion of me if they thought they had to bribe a coach to get me into college, and just the general feeling of betrayal within your own family. So to some extent, they are victims. Some did know, some didn't know. The ones who didn't know, you feel for. But in my view, the biggest victims in all this were these students' teammates and classmates who tried to get into college or onto a college team the right way, through hard work, through practice, through achievement, and then they didn't. Because, in the big picture, there's only so many slots, either on a sports team or in a college admissions class. And for every one of these kids who takes up one of those slots, somebody else misses out. And I did some reporting and I found a really interesting example of this. I found a prep school in Southern California, Newport Beach, called Sage Hill, where there were two tennis teammates. This is what the New Yorker article is about. One was a kid named Adam Langevin, who had, been obsessed with tennis since he was a kid, had a lot, played all the time, was very good, had a lot of potential, was #1 singles on his high school team, and only lost 3 matches his senior year. And he barely missed out on the Division I program he wanted to play for. And he now, he plays for a club team at the school he wanted to go to. Whereas he had a teammate who was not much of a player, you know, didn't even start, you know, sometimes played doubles, but the family were billionaires who bribed the coach through Singer. And that kid, Grant, his name was, he got into Georgetown as a supposed tennis recruit. And that's the other passage I want to read you. This is the kind of the way the chapter begins, by describing these Adam and his horror at finding out what had happened. On a Monday morning in April 2017, students at Sage Hill School gathered in its artificial turf quadrangle known as the town square to celebrate 10 seniors who were heading to college as recruited athletes. The honorees lined up behind an archway adorned with balloons and stepped up one by one as their sports and destinations were announced. Patricia Mers, the head of the private high school in Newport Coast, California, placed a lei in the appropriate college's colors around each student's neck. Most of them had committed to play for low-profile Division III programs. Only 3 were recruits to Division I college sports. 2 were the captains of Sage Hill's girls volleyball and girls soccer teams, bound for Columbia University and the University of Denver, respectively. The other, Grant Janevs, played tennis. As his shirt and blue and gray lei both proclaimed, he would attend Georgetown, the elite Catholic university in Washington, D.C. The town square is framed on 3 sides by Sage Hill's gym, library, and administration building. As Adam Langevin watched the ceremony with other seniors sitting on 4 rows of steps at the open end across from the archway, he was stunned. He had been Sage Hill's top tennis player for 4 years and had lost only 3 singles matches as a senior. He had trained long hours with renowned coaches, hit with college stars and budding pros, and acquitted himself well in regional and national tournaments. Although his two-handed backhand needed work, he had developed a solid serve and a fearsome forehand that one of his coaches, former college and professional player Ross Duncan, described as pro potential, tour level. Between tennis and classes, he'd had no time for other extracurricular activities or a social life. No dates, girlfriends, or even casual lunches with friends, and only 2 school dances in 4 years. He'd sacrificed it all for his goal of playing Division I college tennis, and yet it had narrowly eluded him. Earlier that month, he held back tears when a coach at California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo phoned him in calculus class to say there was no spot on its team for him. He couldn't bear to show his pain to his classmates and fled school right away. When his father, Rick Langevin, came home later, he found Adam sitting on the hood of his car in the driveway, disconsolate. Now Grant, of all people, was a Division I recruit. When Grant had mentioned playing for Georgetown, Adam went along with it, but privately he thought Grant was deluding himself. In their freshman year, Grant had played doubles regularly for Sage Hill, but as the team improved, he lost his starting position. He wasn't even on the team as a senior. He hit the ball hard, but sprayed his shots all over the place. He couldn't stay in a rally for more than 3 or 4 strokes. Grant had a private coach who went to all his matches, but still he didn't get better. Adam sometimes wondered if Grant even liked tennis. I must admit it, I was jealous, Adam told me in June 2019, as he sprawled on a couch in the living room of the Langevins' home, part of a residential development on a bluff overlooking the Pacific Ocean. 5'10" and a sturdy 155 pounds, he wore white socks without sneakers because he was recovering from surgery for an ingrown toenail, a common tennis malady. He was living my dream after I worked for so many years. I was known as the tennis kid. That's what I did. Grant gets up there and I felt people looking over. Why aren't you up there? The whole team was like, what? It was really, really frustrating. When Adam told his parents what had happened, his father speculated that Grant's billionaire grandfather had enjoyed a building at Georgetown. Grant's mother, Michelle Janevs, is the daughter of Paul Mirage, who with his brother co-founded Chef America Incorporated, creator of the Hot Pockets microwavable snack. It was a plausible guess, Universities frequently reward donors by giving their children or grandchildren an edge in admissions. But this wasn't just another example of development preference. The real explanation didn't become clear until the biggest college admissions scam in history hit the headlines. It turned out that after Georgetown admitted Grant Janevs, a foundation controlled by his grandfather wired $400,000 to a California nonprofit that Rick Singer had set up. The Key Worldwide Foundation, it was called. Through that foundation, Singer allegedly paid Georgetown tennis coach Gordon Ernst more than $2.7 million in consulting fees to designate at least a dozen applicants, including Grant Janevs, as tennis recruits. Michelle Janevs' alleged bribes didn't end when Grant enrolled at Georgetown. She paid $200,000 for her older daughter to get into the University of Southern California for beach volleyball, according to court documents. The daughter had been on Sage Hill's junior varsity team. Another $100,000 went to rigging both of her daughters' standardized test scores. After Janevs arranged for her daughters to be classified as having learning disabilities, entitling them to extended time or even multiple days on the ACT, they took it at a West Hollywood center. There, a proctor on Singer's payroll fixed their answers without their knowing it, so their scores would be within a pre-selected range. Most of the media coverage of Operation Varsity Blues has highlighted the accused celebrities, tycoons, and coaches. The culpability of the students who gained admission has also been widely debated. Did they know of the bribery, or were they deceived by their own parents? Less understood is that the repercussions extended far beyond the families immediately involved into their communities and high schools. For every student who benefited from Singer's shenanigans, there were classmates also aspiring to premier schools and sports programs, and sometimes, despite stronger credentials, falling short. They learned firsthand that college admissions, like the television game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, offers numerous lifelines. But in the college admissions game, only the rich and well-connected can take advantage of them. As Adam Langevin reeled, he could find only one consolation. Grant is a nice person, but he's a god-awful tennis player, he told me. I knew he wouldn't see a day on the court. He would never play a match for Georgetown. That prediction turned out to be true. Grant never even made the Georgetown tennis roster. It was simply, the bribe was a vehicle for him to get into Georgetown. Now, in the aftermath of this, by the way, Michelle Janevs was sentenced to 5 months in prison ultimately, but her actual serving of the time has been delayed by the coronavirus outbreak. So I'm not sure when she's actually going to enter prison. But I follow that case in the media. So that's my presentation, and I'm glad to take any questions and